From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening. And please do leave us a nice review. This week, we're going to take a look at the state of the world, the condition of democracy, and the challenges facing the West through the eyes of a former British Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak was leader of the British Conservative Party and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2022 to 2024, when he was defeated at the general election last July by Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Before that, Sunak served as Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's Britain's slightly eccentric name for its finance minister, or the equivalent of Treasury Secretary. He entered politics quite late in life, having been an investment banker with Goldman Sachs and a very successful hedge fund man. He was the first Brit of Indian heritage to lead the UK government. He remains a member of Parliament, sitting on the opposition benches with the rest of his Conservative colleagues, a somewhat diminished band of Conservative MPs. And he continues to take a keen interest in geopolitics and economics. He recently became a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and is working on projects on how to strengthen democracy and how to deal with the challenges that the West faces. Last month, he wrote an op-ed in the Journal calling for a new partnership, a broad alliance of democracies to defend Western values. And Rishi Sunak, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, joins me now. Mr. Sunak, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Gerry. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with a very interesting op-ed you wrote in the Wall Street Journal last month, calling for this new partnership of democracies to face the various challenges that we're facing. One of the things you said in that, I'll quote, you said, if the democracies failed to adjust to these new times and I quote, let an authoritarian axis shape a new world order where might makes right, where technology bolsters authoritarianism and curtails individual liberty, and where trade is a weapon of coercion, that's the risk. I suppose a cynic might say, hasn't that horse already bolted?
No, I don't think so. I think we're clearly living in a time that's very different to the one that most of us grew up in, where, you know, what the world is characterized now geopolitically is a much more multipolar world, the rise of global swing states, as they're called, in the Middle East and India. I think trade relationships, as we know, are changing and becoming less global, whether that's because of tariffs, but also post-COVID, a focus on resilience in supply chains or indeed national security. We've got technology which is much more interlinked with national security than it was before. And I think probably for the first time in modern history, a credible economic, technological, military rival to the United States. That mix of things is very different and creates a different world order. But it is relatively recent that we've been grappling with all of that. And I think there is then the opportunity for us, you know, as ally countries who share values and interests, to come together to deal with that new world and ensure that we can overmatch our adversaries as necessary, cooperate together so that ultimately we can deliver what everyone in our countries wants, and that is higher standard of living, prosperity, but also greater security in a more uncertain world.
I guess what I mean is you talk about the importance of democratic market states, you know, coming together, seizing the moment and shaping the future. But the largest of those democratic market states is led by Donald Trump right now. He's been elected. And he doesn't seem to really share many of the kind of values that you talk about. I mean, one of the things, you know, you talk about the importance of international trade and of free trade. We now have the highest tariff rates in the United States that we've had for nearly 100 years. Aren't Western politics themselves moving in a very different direction from where they were 10, 20, 30 years ago?
No, I think that's certainly right, that there is frustration in lots of places with the international trading system. And I think in that sense, you know, the president is reflecting a frustration in the US that has stretched back and has been brewing for some time. You know, it was actually a previous president who decided that the US wouldn't join the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, for example. And previous US presidents have rightly called out Europeans for not pulling their weight on defense spending. COVID illustrated, as did Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you know, the issue with supply chains and reliance on particular countries for certain things. So I think, to be fair, those are things that are happening across the world and have been for a while. And I do think, though, you know, what the president has done on defense spending is incredibly positive. right? I mean, ensuring that everyone in NATO is now agreeing to spend a proper amount on defence for the New World Order is a big achievement and the right thing. And that's something that I also said when I was Prime Minister. We can't in Europe expect American taxpayers to bear any burden for our security if we ourselves are not prepared to make sacrifices ourselves. So in that sense, that is an incredibly positive development. It needs to be followed through on, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But on trade, yes, I think trade can be very positive. I think the key is, in this world now, it needs to be aligned with partnerships and cooperation on security and technology as well. I think that's absolutely critical. It's reasonable for America, as any country can, to expect there to be free and reciprocal trade, and that should cover non-tariff barriers as well as tariff barriers. And we should differentiate between countries that, as said, are allied on security and technology issues and those that are not. I think that is entirely reasonable. But the thing I'd say on that is we clearly are going to need to reorient the global trading order because of resilience and security. Then having free, fair, reciprocal trade amongst like-minded partners who are doing the right thing on defense and security is important because it can help deliver growth. And we're going to need growth, not least to pay for the extra defense spending that we all now need to embark on.
But we're not going to have the kind of free trade system that we've had certainly since the end of the Cold War, are we? I mean, the US is really, again, as I said, we already have an average tariff here of close to 20%. We're recording this on Thursday afternoon. His deadline expires on Friday, and we're going to see presumably more tariffs. That's gone, isn't it? I mean, that free trade system is being replaced by something like a return to the 1930s, the 1920s, the way things were then. It's just not coming back.
I'd say a couple of things, Joe. I think that one thing, when you talk about the old system is gone, there was clearly flaws with the old system in the sense that, China was admitted to the WTO. And, it's clear now, and that was done with the best of intentions and expectation that it wouldn't only be good economically, that it would help bring China into a kind of slightly more liberal approach. That obviously hasn't happened. But also, it's now clear that China wasn't quite playing by the same rules, and then those rules weren't enforced. So that global trading system didn't quite deliver what it was meant to, and people, unsurprisingly, are not wanting to return to that. And I think that's entirely reasonable. But I do think out of this, we can try and refashion a different order. It's not the same as it was before, but where we do have freer, fairer trade along the lines that I would like, and I was something that I championed when I was in office, but it has to be allied with security and technology as well. And I think that we're not at that point now, for sure, but I hope that we can make progress towards it. And I guess the thing I would hope the administration can see is that they've correctly identified, as they did in their first term, China is a country with both the means and the intent to reshape the world order in a way that is not necessarily along the same values and interests as we have. And they're right to think about how to deal with that. I don't think that will be possible or particularly easy for the US to do alone. And I think allies are going to be necessary in that. And that's why having some type of system amongst like-minded countries where there is freer, fairer trade and where those countries are also contributing to security, defense spending, and common controls on technology is the type of set of arrangements that we should work towards. Now, I appreciate, as you say, we're not there yet, but the work I'm doing at Stanford at the Hoover Institute with colleagues there is to think about what that can look like, and hopefully we can make some progress towards that.
Isn't the problem, though, that there just aren't even really the common shared values? Is there such a thing anymore as the Western alliance? We've seen incredible tensions in it over the course of the last 6 months. It's true, as you say, obviously, that European nations have now agreed to increase their defense spending and their contribution to NATO, and that has been progress. But no one can have looked at the events of the last 6 months and think this is a healthy transatlantic alliance, or forget transatlantic, but Canada too. President Trump still makes aggressive sounding remarks about Canada, and the European countries themselves are going through turmoil. I want to come on to talk about that a little bit. You've got these rise of these populist parties. I'm just wondering, what is the West anymore, and what are its values?
On common values, Europe and the US, without question, it has been a challenging 6 months. Right? Of course it has. And that has primarily, as of course the trade conversations are a part of that, but primarily that has been over Ukraine. And the course of the last 6 months has been difficult for those of us who have spent a large part of our time in office dealing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, being on the front line supporting President Zelensky and his people in repelling Russia. And, especially what happened earlier in this year was very hard to see. That's clear. What I would say is it does feel like we're in a better place now than we were. So there's been, I think, some helpful evolution on that.
Do you think NATO's are now really on the same page on Ukraine? I mean, Trump does seem to have done something of a volte-face. I mean, is that something you think is permanent? Is the alliance now really back together again on Ukraine?
I think that the NATO summit was a moment of unity, and it was not a moment of unity that everyone expected. And it's positive that across the alliance, you saw not just the increases on defence spending, but a commitment to the alliance's values. And I think it will be easier now that, in American eyes, Europe is going to shoulder a fairer burden of defence of the continent to feel that everyone is on the same page. I think that was harder when the perception, rightly in America or from the administration, was, oh, hang on, you want us to be committed to security on the continent and supporting you, but none of you are paying, or very few of you are paying a fair share. Now that that has been at least rhetorically resolved, and we'll get onto the reality of that in time, I think it will be easier to show more alignment on collective security on the continent. I think Putin, a couple of things I'd say is Putin has shown Trump who he really is. And I think that was apparent to those of us who've been dealing with this. Right? He's interested in a greater Russia. He's not interested in Ukraine having any sovereignty. He'll keep pushing until he meets resistance. And it's important that he's met with proper force on the other side. So I hope the president is seeing that is who he is, and then will adjust strategy accordingly. But I think one thing where there is discussion, where I hope the Europeans can move with the support of the Americans, is on seizing the Russian state assets. And this is something that I worked on both as Chancellor, as Finance Minister in the UK, and then as Prime Minister. And in my last G7 call that I participated in, it's something I urged all my colleagues to take forward, because when it comes to being on the same page and practically doing something to support Ukraine, we've got $300 billion of Russian state assets, not individual assets, sitting largely in Europe and some elsewhere as well. And I think the right thing is to seize those and give them to Ukraine. Why? Because I think there is now a credible international law argument for that to happen, that lots of legal experts have worked on. I think we have kind of crossed the principle already, because we're using the interest on those reserves for Ukraine. So in some sense, we've kind of accepted the argument, I think. And from a financial stability perspective, my view, having sat in the offices and talked to enough people in financial markets, which is also my background, is that if we move in concert, the US, the UK, Europeans, and hopefully others as well, I think those risks are essentially minimized, because there isn't an obvious place or other jurisdictions for those holdings to go. And the reconstruction bill for Ukraine is going to be enormous, far in excess of what those assets represent, and at a time of stretched public finances everywhere. I think that's an issue where hopefully the US, Europe, the UK and others can all come together, and there's been support for that from other European capitals as well as me, and then some voices inside the US as well. That would be a way to kind of demonstrate our commitment in a way that I think our publics would hugely support, and would go a long way to demonstrating to Vladimir Putin that we mean business, right? And we're not walking away, and Ukraine is going to get the resources it needs.
One other area where there's sharp differences right now, especially between the US and Europe, is over Israel. President Macron of France has called for the recognition of a Palestinian state. Some European countries have actually gone further and called for Benjamin Netanyahu to be prosecuted. Prime Minister Starmer in the UK just this week said that the UK was ready to recognise a Palestinian state. What's your view on that? The US has obviously continues to back Israel, has been very critical of the idea of a Palestinian state. Where do you stand on that?
I think there's been a kind of long-standing difference between the EU and the US on this question. That's not new in one sense, although it's been crystallized by the current situation. My view has always been, of course, the UK is in support of a two-state solution, as I have very publicly been, but it can't be done in isolation of the context, and it can't be right to do it now, especially while hostages are still being held by Hamas, and it has to be done as something that genuinely delivers a path and a framework towards peace. And it's not obvious, who the interlocutor can be on the other side at the moment, and I've dealt with that as well. So it's not obvious to me that is the kind of the right approach in this moment. That said, there's been quite a long-standing difference of opinion between the EU and the US on that. I was always of the view that Israel did have a right to defend itself, and what it faced on October the 7th was appalling. And actually, what we've seen subsequent to that is an improvement in the security situation in the Middle East because of Iran's proxies being dismantled, largely by Israel, but also what happened most recently in Iran has been, I think, an enormously positive development. And on that, I would say the European acceptance of US bombing of Iran is not something that I think people would have necessarily expected that long ago. And you got praise, particularly from Chancellor Merz in Germany, being very openly supportive of that. Again, so look, I think there is a long-standing difference on this question of Palestine, but what you're seeing more broadly is actually some more alignment on some of these key issues vis-a-vis Iran than you might have expected or definitely seen in the past.
You talk, and you're very focused on this, and this work that you're doing, I know at the Hoover Institution is very focused on this, the future of how we defend democracy, particularly how we face the strategic challenge of China. One of the complicating things in that is that there is such an economic interdependence between the West and China, between the US and China, and also, of course, between many of the European Union countries and China. European Union countries like Germany have long been dependent on the Chinese export market for, the health of their economy. If we are really going to create the sort of partnership you talk about, if we're going to really be able to stand up to China and face down the threat of the authoritarian regime, the authoritarian threat from China, is that going to require a really significant economic decoupling, do you think? Can it be achieved any other way?
I think it is going to require a de-risking in the most important areas. I think most governments across Europe, the West, post-COVID, anyway, all have committees focused on supply chain resilience, identifying critical areas. I'm struck by the number of countries that have passed new national security and investment acts, the UK included, when I was in office, to safeguard investment from anywhere abroad into sensitive sectors of the economy, to protect sensitive intellectual property, particularly in universities. So, that is happening. And I think it's important that work continues to happen and is put into practice. We should be careful, though, that it's focused on the clearly critical issues, because often these things are an excuse for slightly ridiculous protectionism. I'm always reminded of that time when I think Pepsi were trying to take over Danone in France, and I think they decreed that yogurt was a kind of strategic asset or interest for France. So we clearly can't and shouldn't tip into that. But in areas we do need to de-risk. But I think the point here, and it goes back to where we started, I'm not one of these people who thinks that we should all become autarkies, and that is clearly not, I think, realistic or sensible. And that's why alliances matter. Right? I think it's hard for any one country individually to do that. But if you've got a network of countries that are like-minded in their approach to security, defense, technology cooperation, then it is possible to ensure that amongst those countries, we can de-risk in areas like critical minerals as well documented, but active pharmaceutical ingredients being another area, antibiotics, etc. And I think that is why alliances matter. Right, they matter in this new world. It's not sensible or realistic for every single country to go it alone. And by working together, where you do have an alignment of values and you can align on some of these practical steps like inbound or outbound investment and technology controls, you can build up that resilient and de-risk supply chain, which absolutely needs to happen.
We'll take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Rishi Sunak, the former British Prime Minister. We're talking about how the West can be revived. And we'll also talk about the future of conservatism, both in his country and in the United States and indeed around the world. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Rishi Sunak, the former British Prime Minister, and we're talking about how Western democracy needs to be strengthened and how we can do it. Just a quick question on artificial intelligence. You took a keen interest on this, I know, when you were Prime Minister, and of course it continues to be hugely important. Some people talk about us being in a kind of an AI arms race with China. China's clearly making enormous progress in some areas. How much of a threat is that? How destabilizing do you think this competitive race for artificial intelligence, how much of a threat is that to our security?
Artificial intelligence, and particularly, as you say, AGI, plausibly could decisively tip the military security balance of power in the favor of the country that develops it, right? That's not a given. And again, it's kind of tricky to precisely define AGI, but it's a technology that certainly has that potential. And that's why I think it's right that the West, the US in particular, is focused on that race and that competition. What does that mean, right? That kind of practically means questions about export controls and the like, but also investing in homegrown capabilities and R&D and attracting high-skilled talent, getting the compute resources, powered by as cheap energy as possible, are all important ingredients in that. I mean, it's important to remember that actually DeepSeek, and my colleagues at Hoover have done the work on this, and it's quite striking. And the vast majority of researchers at DeepSeek were educated and trained in China. The vast majority of them had never even visited the US or the West in general. That's the quality of the talent that is in China. President Xi has said in the past that he views advanced technology as the sharp weapon of the modern state. And we need to be alive to that. And that's the environment we're in. And that's why it's important that the US and the West is very committed to getting to AGI as quickly as we can. Now, that said, I also think that there is probably not enough focus on another AI race, and that's the race for what I call everyday AI, which is the deployment, the diffusion of the technology across the whole of your country. Because history would tell us that lots of the previous industrial revolutions or technological revolutions that we've had, what you've seen is the benefits are not necessarily always going to accrue to the country that comes up with all the heroic inventions. The benefits accrue to the country that is really smart and focused on getting them spread and adopted across their country. Professor at George Washington University, Geoffrey Ding, who's written about this, and I think as a political leaders, again, there's a lot of commentary and obsession about the AI race between the US and China. We should all, in all our countries, be focused on, well, how do we make sure that our country is benefiting and spreading this technology? And that leads you to a whole different set of policies that need to be focused on. And they're often a bit less glamorous, but they are very important. And unless we do those, then the promise of AI is not going to be recognized. And given the growth challenges, particularly in Europe, that we face, we really need to capture the benefits of AI, and which is why I try and get people to focus on this other AI race as well.
One of the challenges that we do face, and you mentioned it there with the economy, is across the West, is the fiscal challenge. You're in Britain, where you were, as I said, you were Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Prime Minister, where deficits continue to grow in the UK and much of Europe too. Here in the United States, although the economy is relatively healthy, have a $36 trillion debt that's rising to $60 trillion over the next 10 years. How are we going to address this, Rishi? I mean, do we need a fundamental rethink of the role of the state and the size of the state in order to get on top of these fiscal problems?
In a nutshell, yes. So I think it's quite striking. In the last few years, you've had governments in the UK, France, and Germany all fall over, budget issue, a fiscal issue. I mean, that, it just kind of doesn't probably get as much notice as it should, but it speaks to the point that you're making. Many countries across Europe are struggling with deficits that are quite high by historic standards, particularly outside of recessionary periods. Debt as a result of build up over many years, and then COVID is elevated in all these countries, and growth is too low. And that is a challenge. And with the US running the deficits that it is currently and is forecast to continue doing, that is putting pressure on global interest rates, which will have an impact in countries like the UK. And that is a real challenge. And particularly when, as we discussed earlier, there's this commitment from European countries to invest more in defense. Well, they've spent the peace dividend on probably the hardest thing that it is to unwind, and that is health and welfare benefits for their countries. We've seen recently in the UK a spiraling of the welfare bill for those on sickness and disability benefits, ill health benefits, and that is continued to forecast to grow at very rapid rates, up to £90 billion by the end of the decade, which is far more than we spend on defence or anything, health or not health, but education. And the government has not been able to deliver its plans to cut just £5 billion from that budget. If you think about the scale of that bill, even the £5 billion is not a significant dent in that overall budget, and yet it's not been able to do that. And that speaks to the challenge across Europe, and the UK is not alone in this, right? I think people need to confront the reality of the fiscal situation that we're in. I think for a long time, countries across Europe were kind of living beyond our means, and there needs to be a recognition of that and an adjustment of what the state does, the scale of what it does, so that we can focus on investing in defence, which we need to, but also in trying to reduce tax burdens, which are high, and provide a bit more fiscal sustainability, and in doing all those things, drive higher growth.
A couple of questions about politics, about conservatism in particular. You're a Conservative. You're still a sitting member of Parliament for the Conservative Party. You were Conservative Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. I think you came of age very much in the kind of post-Thatcher age. I think post-Thatcher sort of philosophy, if you like. The Wall Street Journal opinion page stands for, free markets and free people. That conservatism has been the dominant strand of politics on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly the US and the UK, over the last 20, 30 years. And yet it seems to be in retreat. We've got this populism, we've got Trump, we've got Reform and Nigel Farage in the UK. The Conservative Party went down to a historic defeat last year. Donald Trump may be many things, but a lot of people, I think, would argue he's not particularly conservative. Conservatives are getting beaten in different parts of Europe too. I mean, what's gone wrong with that conservatism that was so ascendant in the sort of post-Reagan Thatcher period?
I think the first thing to say is that almost every incumbent government everywhere over the past few years has either lost or seen a quite significant reversal. And that goes left and right. And I think it just reflects obviously the difficulty of being in office with COVID, and then in Europe, a war in Ukraine driving up energy bills and inflation to very high levels. And look, it's difficult for any incumbent government to get re-elected if your citizens have experienced kind of 20% inflation or over a very short period of time, and the impact on living standards that it has. So I think that's the first backdrop for all of this, which I think it's important not to lose sight of that. Beyond that, I'd say that we've had this issue for a long time of not being able to deliver enough growth, particularly in Europe. Over time, the state has continued to do more and more and more. COVID accelerated that, and that has been challenging. And we're now, as we've touched on, dealing with the fact that people's living standards haven't grown sufficiently, and they are rightly frustrated by that. At the same time, particularly in Europe, illegal migration has become a real issue, which we need to do more to tackle. And people's frustration is showing up, as you said, and they're popping up with support for other parties because they feel that they haven't got the change that they want. What I would say, though, is I think even if it's not fashionable right now, there ought to be, and I think is, a space and a market for the ideas and the values that you spoke about, which are the ones that I believe, right? Actually, a smaller, more effective government that is not racking up debts for our children to pay, that's focused on empowering families, individuals, small businesses, communities to flourish by getting out of their way, cutting their taxes, ensuring that their hard work is rewarded, ensuring that our societies are cohesive and built on the values that we share, that we're providing security in an uncertain time. As I said, the facts of life are conservative, and I think we just need to remember that. And what you're seeing with some of these populist parties, and you mentioned Reform, is, increasingly they are moving left on economics. They don't have the answers on how to credibly shrink the size of the state to tackle some of these difficult things like welfare spending. And if you look at what these parties are offering, they're not supporting changes to the welfare system. They're talking about nationalizing lots of key industries, right? They're flirting with taxes on big companies and things. So actually, that's not a free market, free enterprise approach to life. That's not going to deliver prosperity to people. And so, I am confident that, of course, look, some of these parties, mine included, have taken a knock as of late. But, in time, I think fundamentally the facts are on our side. Our values are those that most people share. And, whilst people are obviously frustrated now, and you can see that in polls, when people really think about who can provide the solutions to make my life better, to raise my standard of living and to ensure that I feel more secure in an uncertain world, I actually think the traditional conservative values that you've espoused at the Journal and that I believe are the ones that will reassert themselves.
Yeah, you're sitting there in Britain at the moment. Again, I'm over here in the States, but we're watching the UK with, I think it's fair to say, a certain amount of alarm. We've got political disarray. The Labour government, which was elected with a huge majority a year ago, seems to be, frankly, mired in one crisis after another, somewhat reminiscent of the last 5 years of Conservative governments too. There seems to be political kind of stasis. There's a tremendous discontent, immigration, again, something that your government tried and failed to get to grips with, huge continuing illegal immigration. There's real unrest. You're seeing some of this unrest in some of Britain's towns and cities about this. A real sense that the country is sort of coming to a boiling point. Are you worried about the stability of Britain right now?
I'm not worried about the stability of Britain. I think, look, of course, people are frustrated, and they're frustrated because they're not seeing an improvement in their living standards, right? Of course, there's a new government that was elected last year, but it has not delivered what people expected of it. And that's reflected, as you say, in the polls and how people are feeling. And, taxes have gone up and all the things that you documented. But I think this issue of illegal migration is important. And fundamentally, I believe that you need a deterrent. It needs to be crystal clear that if someone comes to our country illegally, that they're not going to be able to stay. And that means you need to have somewhere as a safe alternative to send them to. And that's why I was so committed to delivering our Rwanda plan to do that. And we passed a new law in Parliament to do it. And had we been re-elected, we would have implemented it. Obviously, the new government have decided not to take that forward and not have a deterrent. And what you've seen is the numbers have continued to escalate considerably. That is causing huge frustration. Having sovereignty of your borders and the security that comes with it is critically important. And, without, as I said, a deterrent, you can't deal with it. Until that is grappled with, I think you are going to see continued frustration. And that's not just here in the UK. I would say that more broadly across Europe. And some of the frameworks, the legal frameworks that exist in European countries, are outdated in dealing with this and have certainly stymied progress of governments to grapple with this issue sufficiently. And I think that will need to change. It's something that I said when I was in office. And, I think unless that happens, you're just going to see continued discontentment and frustration in Europe and the UK.
A lot of people look at the UK. JD Vance, the Vice President, mentioned it in that famous speech earlier this year, and see concerns about freedom of speech. Here in America, as you well know, with the First Amendment, free speech is precious. There's a lot of concern, a lot of people have, not just JD Vance, but others, that maybe free speech is being eroded in Britain. Do you see that?
I think the US and Europe, and I put the UK in continental Europe in the same bucket in one sense, in that I've always historically had a slightly different conception on free speech. Right. I think, the US has First Amendment, as you said, and there have always been, and that's before we get onto the online world, a slightly more constrained view of what is acceptable. Right, in the physical world, things that would cross a line in Europe may not cross a line in the US. And that's been a long-standing difference, right? Every country is going to strike a slightly different balance on that. And even in the US, right, there are some things that would be deemed illegal under US law, but where people draw that line is slightly different in Europe than it is in the US. So I think that is an important context. Having said that, clearly there are, over the past few years, we've seen lots of instances of people who are expressing points of view that we may not like, whether they're being arrested or not, have been forced out of university campuses or whatever it is, and that's clearly not right. We must have freedom of expression, freedom of ideas, the ability to disagree. And I actually, when we were in government, ensured that we were protecting freedom of speech on university campuses. Which was a real issue. I think that diversity of thought, we talk about diversity in lots of ways, that diversity of thought is critically important. And it was increasingly worrying to me that particularly with young people, somehow, we couldn't have a proper debate on different things just because people didn't want to engage with the topic. So we actually passed a law to ensure that we did have protection for freedom of speech on university campuses, because I happen to think it's very important and has always been a hallmark of British society.
Free expression, we can all agree, is a good thing. Rishi Sunak, a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thanks very much for your time.
Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.